My name is Shireen Carrico. I identify as a psychiatric survivor, and I'll give you a little bit of context of why this film was so critical for me to be able to show. I came into mental health systems about 32 years ago. When I was a kid, I was around 13 years of age. And along with my entry into mental health services came a variety of labels, a variety of medications. I was ultimately given around 7 or 8 mental health diagnoses. And I was telling a couple of panelists before we started that what was not recognized in my early years of being a service recipient was that I was experiencing significant abuse at home, sexual abuse, and my behavior was interpreted through the lens of clinical diagnostics. And so it really became this ongoing saga of being a mental patient with many mental health diagnoses and a lot of treatments throughout the years. And it wasn't until I was being threatened with an involuntary commitment and heavy duty psychotropic medications that I had my last suicide attempt. And during that process, through a lot of different reasons, or may even call it divine intervention, I had an awakening, if you will, a clarity that told me I needed to really understand about my mental well-being. And from that point forward, I ended up actually rejecting mental health services and did a lot of self-help, mutual aid, learned about mental health recovery, became a professional. I've been working in mental health systems now for 26 years, nationally and internationally. And I had the opportunity to start this beautiful agency, Promise Resource Network, 16 years ago as a survivor-led, peer-run organization. By the time I watched the film, it was probably a handful of months ago now. And just like it did 3 months ago, brought me to tears today because it's so very personal and it's professional, quite frankly. At the point where I watched the film, I had been on medications, cocktails of medications for well over 20 years. And they, 3 months ago, I was on a combination of sleep medication, Ambien, higher than the highest dose that can be prescribed, mixed with Xanax, just to be able to sleep, along with Effexor and several other medications. And I realized that some of the things I had been experiencing, mental fog and some physical health conditions, may in fact be related to my psychiatric medications. So while I've tapered over the years, I still had a couple that I've needed to figure out about. And I started with Xanax after I watched the film and realized pretty quickly that it was in fact the Xanax that was causing the symptoms that I was experiencing. And so I just knew that this film is something that needs to be heard. It needs to be seen. And I am so incredibly grateful to be able to show it here in North Carolina. So thank you so much. Thank you all for choosing to watch it with us. So I'm going to ask the panelists to just introduce yourselves. Can I start with Will? Will, would you do a quick introduction, please?
Sure. Hey, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. It's especially always an honor to be with Shireen and other psychiatric survivors who are strong and telling our stories, and I really appreciate that. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and I identify as someone who is in recovery from my diagnosis of schizophrenia, and I've gone on to do a lot of mutual aid and peer advocacy work. I also work as a therapist. I'm trained in open dialogue, and I do a lot of work around medication withdrawal. I wrote a guide called The Harm Reduction Guide to Coming Off of Psychiatric Drugs. That's been quite successful. It's been spread around the world and is used by a lot of families and individuals coming off, and also clinicians. So I'm really inspired about this topic. I think it's really important, and I'm really glad to be here. So.
Thank you so much, Will. And you and a couple of other folks on the panel are legends in North Carolina. So I'm so grateful. I see Oryx waving his hand because I already told him that. Thank you so much, Will, for joining us. Can I ask, Lynn, will you please do an introduction? You're on mute, my friend.
Hi, Shireen. Thank you so much, and PRN and Peer Voice North Carolina, for screening the film. I'm Lynn Cunningham. It's co-director, it's co-producer, but by no means the sole creator of this work. There is a huge team of good people and advisors and friends and people who made it possible. But thank you today so much for screening it. I also, I want to thank my fellow panelists because for instance, Sandy Steingard was one of the very first psychiatrists who took us seriously. And I mean, this was like 5 years ago when we were starting research, and it was really hard to find psychiatrists who would even entertain the idea of the film itself. Oryx, I applaud you for your equally powerful film, which I think really complements Medicating Normal. It inspired us when it came out. It's reaching people all over the world. Like us, I think you found incredible people to tell your story, well, including yourself. Thank you for all your work in the survivor movement. And I want to say, Will, you don't realize how long I've wanted to meet you, but I listened almost on a day, not quite a daily basis, because I couldn't quite get through the podcast on a daily, but I listened to Madness Radio, almost every single one of them, for the first year of my research. And I would walk around Central Park just like, oh my God, I'm listening to something. I mean, even if I weren't researching for the topic of this film, every single one, the way you listened, the way you simply listened to the people you were interviewing, should indicate to other therapists out there that the art of listening is part of the healing process. Anyway, thank you all for being here today, and I can't wait to talk about it. Angie has been doing such a great job with research. Her story continues. The way she gets these panels going and gets people participating is really an important part of our film, and we just want to keep it going. So thank you.
Lynn, thank you so much. Thank you for making the film that absolutely needed to be made and having the courage to dig into something that we know politically is not an easy topic to be able to uncover and dig into. So much gratitude as a survivor. I appreciate that so much. Dr. Steingard, would you be willing to go next, please?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be here with people who've had such a big influence on me. I've learned a lot from the work of Will and Oryx. So I am a psychiatrist. I have 5 more days as a psychiatrist. I'm retiring in a few days. I've worked in public sector psychiatry early on in hospitals, and for 25 years at a community mental health center in Burlington, Vermont. So most of my treatment has been working with people who experience what my tribe calls psychosis. That's been a deep interest of mine, and using pharmaceutical agents was central to the work I do. But for about, I don't know, really from the beginning, I've been engaged in kind of a critical relationship to the profession. And certainly from the 90s, seeing the, extreme promotion and distortion in the way the drugs were marketed was incredibly disturbing to me. And then in more recent years, I've shifted into an even more fundamental question about how to think about the drugs and how they work and when they're necessary. So that's my story, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Another example of the courage to talk about this openly, especially as a psychiatrist. Dr. Steingard and I actually worked for the same agency many, many years ago in Vermont, and started realizing that we have this interesting interconnection. So congratulations on your retirement, and thank you. It was at that agency that I first heard about mental health recovery. So gave me a great foundation. And definitely not least, but we'll go last in lineup. Oryx Cohen, would you please introduce yourself?
Can't hear you, Oryx.
Oh, you can't hear me?
Now we can.
Now we can.
Oh, okay. Are we just doing introductions now? Sorry, I was running a little bit late. I'm actually, if you've seen the movie Helium Voices, I'm at the golf course that's in the movie, and it's our big member tournament, and I think I may have just made a putt to win the tournament on the last hole. And then I ran to the car. I will say that I loved this film. I really love the film. And my name's Oryx Cohen. I work with the National Empowerment Center. If you don't know, the National Empowerment Center is one of only 5 federally funded peer-run organizations, peer-run in mental health. That means we have lived experience in mental health. It's a national peer-run organization. And I'm also, as you mentioned, a filmmaker with the movie Healing Voices, which I happen to be in as well. And Will's in it. By the way, it's really good to see all of you. And nice to meet you, Lynn. Yeah, I agree that this film really complements Healing Voices really well. So maybe at some point we'll be doing double features. I don't know. Yeah, so anyway, it's great to be here. And I look forward to what other questions and conversation about the film. Thanks.
Thank you, Oryx, and thank you for taking time out in your busy golf tournament to join us today. I know this topic is really critical to you, as evidenced by you being here. So thank you very much for that. So Angie, what do we have going on in the Q&A?
All right, we have a lot of really good questions. So I'm going to start off with kind of an introductory question. How did the issues raised in the film manifest in your own lives and in your professional careers?
I have, as I said, been on psychiatric medications for a very long time. And what I have found throughout the years is it's a combination of a lot of different things, including some pretty significant side effects. There have been times where the psychiatric medications that I've been on have caused me some very intense, overwhelming suicidal thoughts. And there are times when other medications like steroids were introduced to the mix that caused me to experience psychosis. I am not a person that has any label of psychosis or what would be clinically called a psychotic disorder. That was my first experience with that, and it really was a combination of psychiatric medications and steroids that did that. At that point, my doctor basically said, there's nothing we can do. You're going to have to go to the ED. And I work in this community as a mental health professional. I know what that means. I've been involved in it as a client for many years, and that was the last thing I was able and willing to do as a trauma survivor as well. And so I had to wait it out, the experience of suicidal thoughts and psychosis for a while, and just wait it out until it got out of my system. And that is not an unusual experience that I've had throughout the years, based on different medications.
I had a beloved family member who was a scholar athlete and ran into some difficulty, perhaps the awareness of trauma in her own childhood. And she was labeled with a psychiatric disorder that we just accepted as her family. And sort of 10 years later, she was taking what started with one drug, and 10 years later, she was on 10 drugs. And at that point, collecting disability and really unable to function. And we very close-knit family, we were supporting her through the whole thing, but she still was upset and would call almost every day, is everything going to be okay? And I was reassuring her on the level of, we're always going to care for you and you'll never have to worry. But I realized that was not exactly what she was worried about. She was worried more about her agency and was she going to regain what she thought was her mission in life. And at that point, I thought, oh my gosh, I know nothing about what she's taking. And I just started reading. I listened to Madness Radio. And so my perspective about the issues in the film is that people who aren't involved or don't have a loved one or go through it, like Shireen was talking about, really don't understand this world. They know nothing about it. And I just feel that by making these films, writing these books, Sandy's been on panels, that the more we talk about it and make all of these things reality, the more people who aren't associated will begin to become aware. So I believe in curiosity and just talking about it.
I mean, I can talk about my experience. I mean, I didn't enter psychiatry thinking I would do what I did. I thought I was going to be a psychoanalyst, and I have my own issues with that. But then when I shifted, it was in the late 80s, and this was a time where psychiatrists were, you know, the narrative was a lot of optimism. But it became quite clear to me, sort of in the aftermath of Prozac, Depakote, you know, these came out in the late 80s, and they were highly, highly marketed. And I saw the change. And then the newer antipsychotics came on the market, and it was very clear to me in the 90s that what was being promoted by the leaders of the field, which this film articulates so well, wasn't even what was in the literature at the time. And then we've subsequently learned that, as Professor Gacci points out, that, you know, most of the studies weren't even really released. So, you know, in this pattern, which is in the film, that these drugs are highly marketed and touted as being great, and then over time, they're not so great, and that happens to coincide with when they go off marketing. I'm really glad that you pointed out binge eating disorder, because this is a manufactured diagnosis, and it's all related to the intense promotion of the stimulants, which I've observed now in the past 15 years, and that correlates with the SSRIs going off patent. The expansion of the use of the antipsychotics, all these people in this film who don't have psychosis on antipsychotics, why is that? Well, really only about 1% of the population will be diagnosed with this thing we call schizophrenia, but 20% or even more will, you know, collect these other diagnoses. So this is purely a marketing thing. So, you know, how has it affected my life? I mean, I'm not on the receiving end of this, but I've watched it, and it's been incredibly disappointing and demoralizing. And then I think the final shift is this notion that we can't stop these drugs because of the concern of relapse, and relapse prevention being the preeminent thing, as opposed to thinking about the many, many other side effects that people are getting, is just, I don't know. I've said to people as I'm leaving, I mean, I don't want to be a hypocrite. I mean, I'm 65, so it's not like I'm some kind of martyr, and I don't want to take any credit for it, but the center couldn't hold. I know that's a famous book, but that line has come in. I couldn't hold it anymore, to balance these different things, and to live in this culture where there's just no tolerance for life being painful. And so I'll stop there. I'm sure other people have more important things to say.
I guess I could. Oh,
go ahead, please go ahead.
all right. Well, this film really resonated with me. It's basically my story. In 1999, I was diagnosed and put on a lot of psych drugs, and I never wanted to take the psych drugs in the first place. And that being said, I know that lots of people have been helped by psych drugs. I'm not anti-med. I mean, maybe similar to Angie, maybe at first I was. You say that in the movie. But I'm not anymore. But because I've seen drugs help myself and drugs help other people. But overall, they've done me a lot of harm, I have to say. And that first time I was just prescribed a ton of drugs. And I remember going home from the hospital and vomiting like 2 or 3 times a week. And at first, because it was my first rodeo, I thought I had bad pizza or something. But then the psychiatrist over the phone, of course, they can make so many great determinations over the phone, said that this is a a side effect. Okay, well, would have been nice to know that. And I gained like 20 or 30 pounds in a few months. I was sleeping like 16, 18 hours a day. I could definitely see myself becoming one of those career, quote unquote, career mental patients that you see that are very overweight, as that's a side effect of the drugs. And my hands would shake. I had tough time even reading or concentrating. So for me, it was life-saving. Basically, it was life-saving to be able to find a way to wean off the drugs. And again, I still see them as a tool. I sometimes have used them to help with my sleep. At times, I think the big issue is, as stated in the film, as the first and only and long-term treatment, it's having disastrous results. And I think the movie does a really great job of making that compelling argument. So yeah, for me, I feel better when I'm not taking medication, when I'm finding other things for my mental health, spending time with family, exercising, golfing. Yeah, trying to eat as well as I can, getting enough sleep, those types of things. There's lots of alternatives, lots of alternatives to psych drugs that people are just not educated about at all, that can achieve similar results but without the harmful effects. So yeah, like I said, this movie is basically my story, so thank you.
Will, you want to go last?
Sure. Well, like a lot of people involved with this film and on the panel and in our audience today, I mean, I think it's a great film. I'm really glad that this film exists. We need more films like this. I hope that it gets wide distribution and a lot of viewership. But like a lot of us involved with this issue, we've been doing this for a long time. Whenever there's been psychiatry, whenever there's been treating people's brains instead of listening to the person, there's always been a resistance movement. And that goes all the way back to the 19th, 18th century. So we've been doing this for a long time. So I start to ask myself, what is it that's really going on here? What is it that needs to happen? And I fundamentally don't think this is an issue of education. I don't think that if we go out on the streets and we talk to people, that if in a few minutes, people won't agree with us, because a lot of this is just common sense. I think there's a lot of awareness, there's a lot of understanding. I think that education only gets us so far. I think this is really an issue about power and about money. And I don't think that the problem of the profiteering off of suffering, which is what we're talking about with psychiatric medications, the problem of profiteering off of suffering is unique to mental health. It's actually characteristic of our entire healthcare system. And when I was organizing with Oryx and others in Western Massachusetts, we were involved with exposing the risks of Zyprexa, which were illegally suppressed by Eli Lilly. They hid clinical research, trial research results from the public because they were hiding the fact that Zyprexa has a very high risk of causing diabetes. And they're also doing a lot of other things. And so we were able to help expose this. We were able to help get this out into the press. And so Eli Lilly was extremely interested and invested in getting Zyprexa out there because it's so profitable. They're able to make so much money, and they were able to make a lot of money. Now, one of the side effects of Zyprexa is diabetes, and Zyprexa becomes one of the top selling drugs for Eli Lilly. Guess what one of the other top selling drugs for Eli Lilly is a treatment for? Diabetes. Diabetes. So basically what you've done in our society is that we have a for-profit healthcare system that is feeding on disease as a market. Uh, Profitability, capitalism is about expanding markets, so you want to have more disease. So clearly, the antipsychotics are going to start to be marketed for everybody, for smoking cessation, for stress. I'm currently in Northern California. I can't go outside safely because of the smoke situation. I guarantee you that within a few years, there's going to be different kinds of treatments for smoke exposure that are going to be pharmaceutical products that people are going to be selling as a solution, because the solutions from our for-profit healthcare system are not solutions. So I feel very strongly, and if you go out on the street, if you talk to people about this, they will agree with you. We need to get money, private profiteering out of healthcare. We need universal healthcare. The best way forward for that is Medicare for all. That is incredibly threatening to the power of the pharmaceutical companies, and because they have such an inordinate influence on our democracy, they're basically buying politicians and buying votes, and that's both sides of the aisle. That's Democrats and Republicans. I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican. So until we actually break this crisis of money, profit being made out of healthcare, we're not going to solve the problem of psychiatric drugs. Because we all know if we start to talk about other areas of medicine, there are other problems with over-medication. There's other problems with side effects. There's other problems with unnecessary treatments. And this business cycle of selling a drug that's dangerous and then selling you another drug as a treatment to the drug side effects that we sold you in the first place. So I feel really strongly that the survivor movement and the people who are listening to this film and filmmakers, everybody who's involved with this issue, we need to start thinking in terms of coalitions about all the common areas that we have, and the common goal of one of them would be getting universal health care and getting profit out of the healthcare industry, which it does not belong as having disastrous, because that's really at the root. And underneath that is, why can't we do that? Why? Because Medicare for all is incredibly popular. Why can't we do that? Well, because money has corrupted our democracy. And until we start to address that, the crises are going to start getting worse and worse and worse. And it's already starting to be a combination of so many different things: the climate change crisis, the economic crisis, healthcare, the different issues with criminal justice. Things are really coming to the head in this country. So that's kind of where I'm at with it all.
Great answers. So we're going to move on to, this is a very complex question, but I'm trying to pull together a couple questions at once and then one that we kind of had. So I'll first address this part to Sandy, but a number of psychiatrists that we've met throughout all these screenings, you know, and people like Oryx just mentioned it, that some people are helped by meds, some people are harmed. So two things, how do you know if you're being helped, or how do you know if you're being harmed? How can a physician decide between the two? Secondarily, if you believe you're being harmed, what are the steps to, like Will wrote the book on harm reduction with psychiatric drugs, what are the steps that a patient should take if they believe that they're being harmed?
Well, you're correct. First of all, you mentioned I was having mic problems, so tell me if I'm holding this up. Tell me if that works. Okay. So you're right. It's a complex question, and the best way I will answer it is just to give a brief overview about how I think about these drugs, which is highly influenced by Joanna Moncrief, who's a British psychiatrist who I highly recommend her books. And she proposes a shift from what she would call a disease-centered approach to pharmacology to a drug-centered approach. So the disease-centered approach is what those of you who got the alphabet soup of diagnoses experienced, right? You get one label, then there's a problem, and rather than thinking this is a drug causing the problem, you add a new label. And that's what contributes to this escalating use of drugs. Whereas in a drug-centered approach, basically you acknowledge that these are psychoactive drugs. I think one of the psychiatrists talked about the shift we have about drugs of abuse versus these drugs. They're all psychoactive drugs, and their drugs cause problems. You know, as Peter Gacci said, you're perturbing the system when you give this drug. I mean, like others here, I'm not anti-drug. I'm just pro thinking about them in what I think is a more honest and transparent way. So you use the drug to treat symptoms. So like what I say to people is I'm a socially awkward person. When I'm not talking about stuff like this, I'm not the best conversationalist. So if I go to, in the days when we used to have cocktail parties and I go there, I feel awkward. And if I have a half a glass of wine, I feel better. Now, you could say I have cocktail party deficit disorder. You could say I have a brain that responds to alcohol the way brains do, which in the short run, it's a little disinhibiting and it's a little bit of a euphoria and it makes you feel better. And I get through it in a little bit better way. And you can talk about all drugs that way. We need to study them that way. We need to understand their psychoactive effects. A lot of people in the film talked about numbing. And that's because that's what I think most of these, drugs either seem to elevate or lower you, but there's a kind of numbing effect that a lot of these drugs cause, and they may be subtly different, and we haven't done enough to really understand them. Now, if you understand that, then when someone takes a drug, you talk about the psychoactive effects, you talk about what it's doing, you talk about what some of the downsides are. You start low, you go slow, you're very clear about what you're targeting, and then together with the person writing the prescription, you make a determination about whether it's helping or not. Now, I can't answer for someone who may have been on some cocktail or whatever, whether it's helping or not, but that's how I use the drugs, and that's my best way of answering, at least beginning to have an answer with that to that question.
Anybody else?
I would just say I agree completely with what Sandy is describing, and this is a harm reduction approach. You understand that there are risks, there are downsides. That's true of any drug. It's true of coffee. It's true of refined sugar. Anything that's psychoactive that has a consciousness changing, a mood altering effect also has a downside. There's no free lunch when it comes to psychoactives. So it's not about eliminating risk. It's about understanding whether the risks are worthwhile based on the benefits that we're getting. We make decisions like this all the time. One of the traps that I think the psychiatric system gets into is that it looks completely in terms of controlling risks and where the blame is going to be deposited. So a psychiatrist who refuses to take someone off of drugs is acting quite rationally from their perspective, because the risk involved, they're going to get blamed by their colleagues, they're going to get blamed by families, they're going to get blamed by a culture that doesn't acknowledge the dangers that the drugs themselves impose. So I think that a lot of people also tend to think of the risks in terms of some kind of objective chemical quotient that can be determined. But one of the things that we know about all psychoactive drugs, and I'm sure if we all talk about our experiences with alcohol, this will become quite evident, that the experience of psychoactive drugs is extremely individual. Different people have very, very individual experiences. There are some people who have a very strong reaction to alcohol, and they can spiral into extremely dangerous results of just taking one small drink from alcohol, whereas other people seem to be able to just drink extensively and then just act like they haven't taken any alcohol at all. Now, is that solely explainable by the chemistry of the drug? Absolutely not. There's an entire placebo effect dimension. There's an entire expectation effect dimension. So when we do what Sandy is describing, which is to have a drug-centered and not a disease-centered approach, we need to understand that it's also focused on the person's individual relationship to the drug, because all psychoactives have a different response to different people. And that's also true of the withdrawal process. And I'm doing a big study on antipsychotic withdrawal right now. We have more than almost 4,000 respondents. The diversity of responses to the withdrawal process is as diverse as to taking antipsychotics to begin with, which is consistent with the idea that you have a personal relationship, an individual relationship. You have an idiosyncratic and a very subjective relationship. Now, the massification of healthcare under capitalism is not about treating individuals. It's about mass producing products on an assembly line. It's basically the model that came from the mass production of automobiles. That's exactly what has been brought into psychiatry and mental health care. You fit a certain size widget, we put you on this conveyor belt, and then we send you down the track because our research and our statistics and all this presumably suppose that we can control the outcome based on it. That is a disaster in medicine. It's especially a disaster in mental health care, where we know that emotions, personality, meaning, tolerance of stress, tolerance of pain, the subjective response to life crisis, all these things are deeply, deeply personal. So unless we put the person at the center of this conversation and their unique responses, we will continue to miss people and continue to hurt people.
You know, Will, related to your answer to that, there was a question in the chat that kind of touches on it, which is, where are people with lived experience in all of this? Do they want to come off? Why are they not coming off? Are they asking to come off? And, you know, that's kind of a generalization. I'm not going to share sort of data on it, but I will share the anecdotal experience, particularly in public behavioral health. So you have this belief system of chemical brain imbalance that has been sold, and it has been believed. You have the risk quotient that you've talked about, Will, about taking people off and what could happen to my license. And you have this message that has been given to users, to service users, that the answer comes in a pill. And your job in all of this is compliance. And this is particularly in the public behavioral health side that I'm speaking of right now. And so if your job is compliance, there is no space for questioning or asking about these medications, or even sharing honestly when they're impacting your well-being, your day-to-day. I'm going to add another level to that there is a level of coercion and force that goes along with this on the mental health system side. So then it becomes, if you don't take these medications, fill in the blank. If you don't take these medications, you're going to be involuntarily committed. If you don't take these medications, you're going to lose your housing voucher. If you don't take these medications, we're going to kick you out of treatment. And so on the side of people with lived experience, if I even recognize that these medications are having bad side effects, to share them with a service provider is incredibly risky to even my independence, right? My rights can be removed if I bring that up. This is how scary this has become between people with lived experience and psychiatric and mental health providers.
That comes to the next set of questions I kind of wanted to ask, and especially because of the lived experience of the panel, that a lot of the chat was mentioning, you know, like, well, what about people with diagnosed as schizophrenia, or what about people with psychosis? And I know Sandy has a lot of research in this area about deprescribing people with those particular, you know, serious labels, and what does that look like for them? So I just wanted to, and also another part of that question was, what are alternatives, like alternatives to viewing suffering other than the biomedical model? So can we just discuss that?
Yeah, I could start. So yeah, I will say I am one of those people. Yeah, there's a large segment of society that probably thinks I need to be on meds, or else I'm dangerous and I could go into altered reality, and who knows what's going to happen. So I don't think the conversation really changes based on someone's experience. And I'm sure Will can tell you some of his own experience. I used to look a lot different than this. And so even that person who society has written off on the back ward of a psych ward diagnosed with schizophrenia, I believe as long as someone's alive, there's hope. And there's still these major problems with the medication. And one of the major problems is that people are not given the opportunity to learn from their experience. We're told that the experience is meaningless if we're hearing voices or seeing visions or just in a different world, that what we need to do is just get rid of that experience as quickly as possible. And therefore, we don't learn. And there are folks that are big time more trauma survivors than I am and have been through, and there's reasons behind why these things come up. there's things that we've dealt with in our lives. So sometimes it's trauma. Maybe sometimes it's just that we have mystical, spiritual people, and maybe we need to listen to what they have to say and not be afraid of them. So yeah, when I was given the opportunity to actually try to work through my experience, I learned so much. And for me, it was, you know, some unresolved trauma in my life that I needed to deal with. And I think people need to be given that chance. If you look at there's a whole nother movie could be done about the diagnoses and where that came from and how arbitrary that is and how little science is behind quote unquote schizophrenia. What are we even talking about? Yeah, there may be times when medication is helpful, again, as a tool. If things are, the way I see it, if things are like way too intense to deal with, and right now, if there's some big trauma coming up or some big spiritual opening, and it's just like, whoa, the meds can, I think, be helpful sometimes. But having people on these for 30 plus years in mega doses, and then saying that and thinking that that person is leading a good life, that to me is delusional. Delusional thinking. There's so much more hope for every single person.
In terms of alternatives, you know, I was asked in an interview a few weeks ago the connection between mental health, the causes of mental health, and correlation with trauma. And, you know, I was asked, so what causes mental illness? And I said, well, you know, that's, I guess, the age-old question that researchers and people are still trying to figure out. But what I can tell you is this: the majority of survivors that I know, people that are in mental health systems, including myself, including many, many colleagues, what we have in common is trauma. I fear that trauma is becoming co-opted. It's being a term that now is being coined, just like recovery from mental health issues is a term that can become co-opted. Peer support is being co-opted. And I fear that trauma is being co-opted as well. So that's a whole nother dialogue. But I do know that when I came into mental health services, if my behavior was seen through the lens of intense emotional distress that was understandable as a kid that was experiencing abuse, the course of treatment, the understanding of myself, my worldview, safety, the way others interacted with me would have been very different than getting treatment diagnoses, being threatened to be hospitalized multiple times, being told that I would never be able to go to college, Syracuse graduate. Those are all the prophecies that I was given as a kid at 13 years of age. So not only am I being abused, and I'm experiencing significant emotional distress, which is understandable, I come into services that are harming me further by basically telling me I'm sick and I'm broken and that there's no hope to get any better, and then coercing me or forcing me, trying to threaten me into further treatment. So when we talk about alternatives, let's look at the experience that people have, right? And look at it from a lens of healing and understanding rather than pathologizing.
I mean, one thing that I would add, because the treatment of psychosis, you know, from a professional point of view is what I did all these years. And I very much agree with the harm reduction model that Will mentioned. And the way that I've come to think about it is that in psychiatry, relapse prevention became the preeminent thing, that the models of care are all about this model that these conditions will recur, and the biggest risk is relapse, and the drugs are continued to prevent relapse. And, you know, where I've come to is to say relapse, whatever that means, because it may be a withdrawal phenomenon, maybe it's something else, I don't really know at the end of the day, is one thing, but it's not the only thing. And there's other things, you know, there's the weight gain, there's the deadening of emotions, there's, you know, and so with each individual person, you talk about the various different kinds of risks. And for one person, what we call relapse may not be at all dramatic. It may be someone calling me up on the phone. I do talk to people on the phone, Arx, and saying, I don't feel right the way I am. I'd like to go back up on the dose. And we talk about that and we do that. There may be other people who will have some more dramatic events that do put them in harm's way that are very worrisome, but to treat everybody the same just doesn't make sense anymore. The other thing is I really am not so much focused on drug or no drug, but I think dosing is enormously important. And, you know, as I was winding down my practice and looking at what I'd done, there were people who are on 1/10 of the dose that they were on before. And I think if someone hadn't brought that up, they might have lived their lives on the same dose. And I do think for most of these drugs, being on 1/10 the dose is very different than being on, you know, whatever you started with. So there's just a lot of things that one can talk about, and it's not as, you know, monolithic as being on drug or not being on drug.
Yeah, I would just add that, again, when we come back to a harm reduction perspective, it's really about meeting people where they're at. And so what is going to relieve one individual's suffering is an incredibly broad, complicated question that humans have been facing forever. And psychiatry kind of colonizes realms that are best addressed from an existential, a spiritual, just a human meaning standpoint. What does it mean to have a successful life? What does it mean to be free of suffering? These are huge conversations that we can have. And when we ask, like, what is psychosis and what is madness? I mean, we're really touching on some of the most basic questions about being human. Sometimes it's very simple. The person's having a reaction to a malaria drug, or as Shireen mentioned, they're having a reaction to a steroid. I should mention even topical steroids can cause psychosis. Read those little inserts and be very careful. I know someone who was getting fertility treatments, and because they wanted to get pregnant, the drugs triggered a psychosis. So sometimes it's as simple. Google gluten intolerance and psychosis, or caffeine. Sometimes madness is as simple as an exposure to some chemical or toxin or drug or something of the person. Sometimes it's much more deeply mystical and deeply mysterious. And we should say that even the best treatments, the best alternatives that we talk about, whether it's the open dialogue approach, whether it's some of the approach that I see that's wonderful in the Hearing Voices movement, whether it's some of the innovative alternatives, Soteria House, whether it's even some of the places like in Zanzibar that Ethan Waters talks about in his book, where they have very good outcomes for people who would be seen as schizophrenic because they're held in a religious, spiritual context. Even if we look at all of those, it seems that there are some people that we just don't know what to do with them. What is going on in there? And that has been a human mystery since the beginning of time. And we can talk about the initiation into shamanism. We can talk about revering people as saints and sadhus in traditional indigenous cultures, non-Western cultures, or historically in Western cultures. But even in those cultures, sometimes there are people they just don't know what to do with. So to have a simple answer for how do you respond to suffering that looks like madness, I think is hubris. And having said that, I will venture a hypothesis, which I think that Shireen is very much in the right direction. I think that trauma is a big part of what most people are going through. What I tend to see is that there are two factors that I'm working on more frequently than others. And those factors are a sense of the person's control over their life and a sense of the person's isolation. That typically when I'm working with people or I'm working with myself or in groups, the themes are about a loss of control. And it could be the loss of control of having no meaning. I don't know what these voices mean. Now I have a trauma framework. Now I have more control. Now I have a mystical framework. Now I have more control. Now I have a diagnostic framework. Maybe that gives me more control. So a sense of empowerment of your life, and also a sense of connection, a sense of not being isolated, not being banished, of not being stigmatized. when I look at the most effective alternatives, which I just off the top of my head, open dialogue, Soteria House, Hearing Voices movement, there's a thread that runs through them. And that thread seems to be that they help people to feel more in control, and they help people to feel less isolated. So that's typically what I'm most interested in. Although I'm also open to, hey, it could be something as simple as get this person off of steroids, or get this person into a religious context where they don't have to be freaked out about hearing voices. I'm very open to all kinds of different possibilities. And I think that takes time. And that's also one of the reasons that I think open dialogue is successful, is that it just takes they just give a lot of time to find out what's going on in the person's life, talking with people in that person's social group.
Excellent. So I'm going to go with 2 more questions because I'm mindful of the time. So this first question might be kind of quick. There's some mention in the different messages and chat box about status quo mental health care. Because the panel have been doing this for so long, they're wondering if you've seen any changes. Has there been any movement in this? I know Will spoke to, the greed influence and money influencing things not to change, but have you, as people as activists or prescribers, have you seen any changes over the years?
One thing I'll say is I think psychiatrists who are coming up now, I've actually, part of retirement, I've had to find replacements. And some of the young people that I'm meeting, they didn't come up in the 90s with this stuff that was going on. And it seems at least the ones I'm meeting are getting exposed a little bit more to these ideas. I mean, honestly, I'm not feeling very optimistic about anything right now. But that's, I have seen some younger people that seem to be more open, but I don't know.
I think it's depends on where you are. If you're somewhere in Shireen's community and have access to their resources, and there's, I would say, very few more progressive organizations and very few progressive psychiatrists and providers around. But if you happen to be in one of those areas, like Western Massachusetts, for example, then yeah, we've done film. I mean, I think these film screenings help. I mean, I think every little bit helps. Education and awareness in areas where there's a stronger peer movement, and there have been public screenings of films like this, and there's been conversations, and yeah, in those communities, there's going to be a little bit more of an openness to these ideas. But you go somewhere, let's say the South, or even a lot of places in Michigan, I've heard folks really struggle there, in the Midwest, or almost anywhere else than these little pockets, then no, not much progress has been made. And we've actually, I think, lost a lot of ground.
Brooks, I agree with you. For me, it's been very geographical. So there are these slivers of places where pioneers have settled and decided that they weren't going to be okay with status quo. And they're going to challenge it, and they're going to find a way, in spite of the system. Now I'm projecting, mind you, in spite of the system, that we are going to bring a new experience for people coming into systems, and also shape the social context, the justice, I'll say in air quote, context of mental health and substance use, homelessness, former incarceration, and that we are going to gently or not so gently challenge what has been prevailing. It's painful. I mean, we've been doing this for 16 years in a southern city of Charlotte, North Carolina, and we work in multiple systems challenging the paradigms, and some places pick it up and get it, and they see the effects of it, and they say, I don't care what you're doing. I don't know what you're feeding people. I don't know if it's lollipops that you're giving people, but it's working. So beautiful, keep doing it and we will support you and we will remove barriers. But I find it to be very geographically based. When I've worked overseas, different countries don't have the perspective necessarily of mental health that we have. Even working in Vermont in general was very different than the cultures working in the Midwest and in the South. So I think it really does vary. I agree that I think we're losing some ground. The benefit to me of some of the consumer survivor ex-patient movements is there was an energy against, human rights issues. We're starting to see that now come back. Thank goodness with some of the racial issues that are happening, and people are starting to recognize that there's a social justice construct here that needs to be challenged. But I'm in agreement with you, Oryx.
Yeah, I would just add that, so I'm a big believer in this work. I think that we're all doing the best that we can. I have seen some positive things. I think Sandy points out to some of the younger folks are making connections with intersectionality and saneism that are starting to come forward. But I want to be provocative, and I want to challenge our movement to really acknowledge that we set a goal 15, 20, 30 years ago, and we failed to achieve that goal. Our movement has failed to achieve its goal. So I want to encourage us to think about having very, very different kinds of strategies, very different kinds of ways of approaching this issue, and also to think that maybe, if we get one or two paid advocates, and we get one or two federally funded or county funded or state funded programs, that money might be good, but it might also have a co-optation and a kind of like a defanging effect. I think that we should be really embarrassed right now that it wasn't the psychiatric survivor, psychiatric mental health movement that got police and mental health on the national agenda. It was the Black Lives Matter movement that is pushing getting this whole question of why are police responding to people in crisis. Our movement wasn't able to get that into the national attention. Black Lives Matter and all the protests that it triggered out of that. So I've been working with a group, a coalition, Compassion Not Cops. You can go online for it. It's a organization that's getting started. It's a coalition to just get police out of mental health. And we're really trying to get the mental health organizations to catch up with what's happening in the streets. And that's a really big red flag for me, that we've lost our kind of like spearhead, cutting edge, pioneer, innovator role, that we've kind of gotten kind of institutionalized, kind of complacent. We've kind of become part of the movement. And thank God that Black Lives Matter has come along to push this issue to the forefront, because police should have no role to play in mental health. This should be one of our top priorities, to get police out of mental health. Once we get them out, it opens up, well, what are the alternatives? What are we going to put in their place? And then we start to talk about all the things that we've been doing and pushing for many, many years, but it took Black Lives Matter to get this on the front lines of the public agenda.
Excellent.
I'd
Yeah.
like to,
Go ahead, Lynn.
I just want to say on a very first of all, Will, I don't think you guys have failed, because if you had failed, then I wouldn't have been inspired. We wouldn't have made our film. I think that's wrong to say that you failed. I mean, I know why you're saying it, but I do have more optimism based on, I guess, how individuals are responding. One doctor that I met a long time ago at the Integrative Health Conference moved up to Northern Michigan. She's a child pediatric psychiatrist. She inherited about 100 kids who were being given antipsychotics for basically just, unruly behavior in school and parents unable to contain them. And she's managed in the little over a year or two that she's been up there to get them off their antipsychotics, to convince the parents, you do not need to go get fancy supplements. You can just go to the dollar store. You can get some magnesium. You can give them a bath at night. They do not need to be on antipsychotics. And I just think that she's one person, and I think how many people we all know. I do think it is different in different geographic areas, but I think the more we talk about it, and I do think the change is occurring. I do a Google search now compared to what I did 5 years ago when I started researching, and there's so much more written. Now, this does not mean systemically that we're there yet or that we have the right organization set up, but I do think there's more awareness that the average person can glean from the internet at least. So that's just trying to be optimistic.
All right, last question, then we'll do closing thoughts. Maybe this isn't, I don't know, there's so many themes I could say, but one is the theme about earlier when we touched on, you know, that if you're not compliant or you're questioning your prescription or you're thinking about coming off, you know, harm reduction wise or whatever, that's being, you know, seen as threatening to a provider. So there's some question about like how can peer support and advocacy support individuals who want to, but there's also the other layer of prescribers not believing patients when they say, I think my medication is harming me. So, and then a tangential idea is how the withdrawal community, the layperson community, Will Hall's book about harm reduction guide, how it's almost been taken out of the medical system and people are doing this themselves. So can we kind of talk about that as the closing discussion?
I'll talk of the peer support piece of it. As an agency that employs the majority peers, peer support specialists, I would say it's become so incredibly co-opted that the foundation and the framework of peer support that really came from a human rights, civil rights movement has been all but erased on the ground. And if a peer supporter is going to be helpful to people, part of that role is to help people find their voice and support them unconditionally in being exposed to possibilities, being able to dream again, and having unconditional regard and supporting you regardless of what that feels like or the direction you want to go in your life. That means that you have to, as a peer supporter, be really connected, right, to voice and choice. And you have to have number one, you can't yourself be co-opted into believing that medications are the answers, because we see that a lot. And so the peer support specialist is saying, well, you just have to comply. You just need to take your meds. Or you ally so much with the service treatment team that you are just going back and forth and being that mediator or seeing yourself as an extension of that team, leaving the person with nobody there that is actually seeing me and trying to understand my experience. This is a role for peer support workers, but you have to be well trained and you have to be very intentional as a peer supporter that is part of your responsibility. You have to be supported within your organization to take that responsibility very seriously. You have to have your own skills to navigate very political waters and how to have those conversations and then support people to have the conversations themselves when they feel safe to do so. So on the peer supporter side, that is all wrought with a lot of layers and unpacking that needs to be done to get it even close to being where it was intended to be.
Yeah, I would just add that throughout medicine, there's a shift happening towards a more collaborative approach, and other areas of medical care are much more advanced in terms of patients having the right and expectation to speak up and have preferences and disagree with their providers. But the psychiatric mental health realm still has this custodial kind of view where it's about control and it's sort of like the asylum without walls. And so it's lagging behind the rest of medicine. But pretty much if anyone goes to a doctor, the first thing they do when they come home is they search on Google, they get alternatives, and we just need to spread that mentality into psychiatry and mental health. It's not a threatening thing. It's not a radical thing to talk about coming off your medications, to talk about alternatives for dealing with what is getting diagnosed with psychosis. So yes, a lot of people really do have to take a proactive pushback kind of stance with their providers throughout medicine. And you have to do that in medicine. It's dangerous to just go along with what your doctor says in any area of medicine, because there's all kinds of treatments that are prescribed that are unnecessary, that can be very risky, that can cause additional problems. So yes, people do take initiative. They start their own withdrawal process and their own reduction process themselves. Typically, it's better if you have some kind of support. That's why the internet is so great. There's lots of support that you can get out there. But sometimes people do it on their own. I'm not going to say that everyone fails if they're alone. People do this on their own and they're successful. It's their right to make that choice if they're facing that kind of isolation, that kind of political situation. But you have to, again, balance the risks and the benefits of doing that to make the best decision for yourself, I think.
Can I respond with a question? Thank you, everybody. I just want to say that thanks for having me. Angie, I admire what you're doing. You're paying it forward. Shireen, you rock. Everybody on this panel rocks. My question for you is, what are you doing when I'm sure lots and lots of people are seeing the movie and then saying, what do I do? Help me. What do you do with all the, yes, what are you guys doing through Medicating Normal group when you get all these questions and help me, and what are you doing?
Yeah, we get a lot of emails about individual cases. And I think I was just thinking about this at the grocery store last night, actually. Like, you can't give individual advice. Like, it's impossible. I don't know your context. I don't know your situation. I don't know your tolerance for deprescribing. I don't know, I don't know you as a person. So it's so hard. And then at the same time, I feel like I'm being cold when I do that. When I say, I can't help you on an individual level, not only for my own, because I'm still in the healing process. The film is, my activism through the film is helping me heal my trauma from the medical system. But we get tons of emails. We have alternatives and a reading list on our website. We have some coaches that have stepped forward that do help people that while they're, as a supporter, as you're coming off. We list like the harm reduction guide. We list Inner Compass Initiative as other things. Benzo Buddies is another one. And then our YouTube channel has over 110 now outtakes from the film that are additions. So if you just go down and read the comments, people are supporting each other through this. Like, oh my God, this happened to me. So it has become an organizing tool. The film isn't just the film. Like, these discussions are so important. People binge watch the panels more than they watch the little 2-minute clips, So I don't know. There's a lot of support out there. It's just disappointing because I never would have thought this was a thing unless it happened to me. I would never have believed it. That, oh my God, I have to get support on a Facebook group. Are you kidding? But it's happening. And I mean, I watch it every day. I could probably show you 100,000 patients right now that are tapering and supporting each other without medical help, which is both beautiful and scary at the same time. But they do it. And I was one of them. Thanks for the question, Oryx. Okay, so let's do last thoughts. So if you want to say anything about your own work, about where can people contact you or read things that you find helpful or whatever, closing thoughts, and then we'll sign off.
I'd just like to say thank you to this incredible panel for all the work you're doing. You have inspired us. Keep it up. Do not lose faith. I guess the question, very few people are posing this question, but it has been posed. The film is irresponsible because it's going to convince people who should be on meds to be getting off their meds. And how can you do that? That's really irresponsible. And I guess my answer is that it's irresponsible not to be talking about this. So I guess the discussions need to be careful. We need to listen and consider all options. And talk about it, talk about pros and cons, and just keep the dialogue going through Oryx's film, through this film, through other films that are going to be made, I hope. Thank you guys. Thank you for attending and talking.
I guess if I'm going to do closing thoughts, I put in the chat, you check out Healing Voices on Amazon Prime if you like this movie. It's pretty cool that we're on Prime now. Um, um, so, and I would also just say the one thing I didn't say that I had in my notes was, we've gotten the critique, and I'm sure you're going to get the critique, Angie, of you're anti-med. This is an anti-med movie, even though all efforts are made to say you're not and be inclusive. And my response a lot of times to that is, when you present facts and you present a critique, the truth and facts can be perceived as anti something when they're just so compelling. And there are a lot of problems. And I think the whole anti thing is honestly a way of dismissing. If I say you're anti-med, then I don't have to listen to what you have to say. And unfortunately, that's where we are at in this country in a lot of different areas. This it's about ideology. It's about belief. And it's almost like a religious thing. Like, how did that happen? How did medications become this thing that was just like so important that we can't take an honest look at it? So I appreciate you for taking that honest look and just preparing you for those critiques.
It's funny you said, like, I just said that same thing that you just said on a podcast recording like 2 days ago about it's a weapon to not, be open-minded. But anyway, okay, Will and Sandy, your turn.
Okay, I'll go give Will the last word. Well, first of all, thank you for including me. It's really an honor. And as I've said, I've taken Will and Oryx's class and have learned a lot. I think it's just very, I just don't know what to make of the fact that most of the knowledge about drug withdrawal does come from the perspective from the large, massive numbers of people who've taken the drugs and come off it. And I think this point about the it's anti-med, it's anti-psychiatry. And I think it's pro-psychiatry to want to think very carefully about these psychoactive drugs and understand what it is we're doing. And so again, it's something I don't understand. There's a little Twitter thing going on right now because there was an article about anti-psychiatry and people that are very articulate are challenging, like, why is it that you're so comfortable dismissing the voices of thousands of people? And most of the knowledge really is not within psychiatry. You've mentioned Inner Compass. There's an Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal that is doing work. There's a number of really good websites that people here know better than I do. And there are a few psychiatrists. Mark Horowitz, I know he was on one of your panels. He works with Joanna Moncrief and is putting out some really helpful papers that understand from, pharmacologic side why you need to go slowly, particularly at the end. But one final point is I did do one small project, which is I kept track of what happened when I brought these ideas into my clinical practice, specifically with people who had been diagnosed primarily with schizophrenia. So the idea was they need to be on drugs for the rest of their lives. And I'm the one coming in saying, wait a minute, I'm not so sure this is a good idea. Do you want to talk with me about tapering? And I knew that I would remember the worst outcomes. And so by tracking it, I wanted to help my memory. And what I can tell you is sitting in an office with a psychiatrist who says, I'm not sure it makes sense to continue. I'm willing to work with you. You did not have wholesale abandonment of drugs. I mean, the main outcome is that the people that I worked with were very thoughtful, cautious, careful. There are a few times where people went off drugs. That's often happened before. And so I think these conversations are not nearly as dangerous as is sometimes said. That would be my final comment.
Yeah, I really appreciate being invited and being part of these conversations. I think that I think Oryx, you're right. We do get pushed into a box with the anti-vaxxers and the anti-science kind of ideological dismissal. But I agree with Sandy. This is actually in the spirit of better science. We're trying to actually do better science, and so that's the pushback that I would give on that. And there's a couple of points in the comments about. I mean, it is scary when someone is going through an altered or extreme state, when someone is depressed and they're talking about suicide, or they're struggling with anxiety and they can't manage work or taking care of kids. I mean, these things are scary, but I think we make a really big mistake when we imagine that there are experts out there. I notice that I'm sitting here in my therapist chair with my therapist books behind me. This is all stage props. This is all just theater, okay? The expertise is in you. The expertise is in you. We have a big, big crisis happening on the planet right now. It is getting worse, and it's far worse than anything that we can just look at in psychiatry. It's a much, much bigger crisis. And this crisis demands of us that we rediscover the basics of what it is to be human. We got to learn how to sit with people in fear. We got to learn how to deal with people around anger. We got to learn to deal with people around sadness. And we got to be able to learn those things in ourselves. This crisis is demanding that we all bring forth our inner expertise on what it is to be human. And that sounds trivial. It sounds like, oh, being human. Look around you. We're surrounded by a society of machines and materialism and greed and competition and fear and isolation, and people don't even know their neighbors. The societies the machinery is an anti-human machinery. And I think that's fundamentally why I continue to do this work in the psychiatry, mental health, madness world, because it constantly is asking us, what does it mean to be human? And how can we bring forth our expertise, our innate expertise to be human? Because I think that's all we really need in these conversations.
And Will, to piggyback on you for my ending statements, I would say something similar. There is an expertise that goes along with the wisdom of living a life that other people may find really difficult or not understanding. And we keep putting expertise in the hands of degrees and licenses. And while there is a knowledge that goes along with expert by education, there is a wisdom that goes along with expert by experience that cannot be replicated. And we have to guide these conversations and lead the shift if we expect that it is going to be different. One of the initiatives that we are taking on right now is hiring COVID survivors to do a COVID peer-to-peer support initiative, because our medicine is catching up with survivors right now. Our best historians are people that are living it. They are telling us what is happening to their bodies. They are telling us the impact it's having on their lives. And we're having to capitalize on that because we don't have the science to back up how to prevent it and how to treat it and how to eliminate COVID, right? We understand it when it comes to medical issues more than we do with mental health. And so when I talk about COVID peer-to-peer support, I don't say that means that if you have been somehow affected, like all of us have, with COVID, that's what we're looking at. We're talking about people that have survived it, because you have a unique experience and unique knowledge and a unique expertise that we need to capitalize on. It's no different with mental health. It's no different with homelessness. It's no different with people that have been formerly incarcerated, domestic violence survivors. It's just that our definition of expertise is not falling within the category of lived experience. And it requires us to step up into some really uncomfortable, vulnerable places to be leaders in shaping the dialogue and, quite honestly, reclaiming the narrative around all of it. So if anybody wants to, if you're in North Carolina, please connect to Peer Voice North Carolina, because that is all about legislative change and mobilizing different groups of people or on topic-based coalitions to get involved in social justice reform and behavioral health reform. If you're in Charlotte, please feel free to check out Promise Resource Network. We are an open access environment, and we're completely peer-led, and we would love to have more family members.
All right, thank you all so much. And I'll just close with, we have a lot more screenings coming up, and they're all virtual. So if you're in the audience and you liked what you saw, please share it. Our website is medicatingnormal.com, and we're on all the social media platforms, Medicating Normal. So just Google us and you'll find us. And if you know an organization that would like to host a panel like this one, just email us at medicatingnormal@gmail.com. Thanks again to everyone. This was an excellent panel. I've been looking forward to this for 2 weeks. I've been so excited about it. So thank you all for coming, and thank you audience members for being here. Have a good one.